I was looking through some old journals recently, sort of tracing the timeline of my own political arguments, and I noticed this strange recurring pattern.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Back in the early 2000s, there's this one entry about a really heated dinner table argument where I was practically shouted down for refusing to support the Iraq War.
I think we all remember those conversations.
Right. The person across from me was just adamant. If I wasn't with the war on terror, I was against safety, against America. It was this demand for total allegiance to that specific hawkish narrative.
Heated by the whole package.
The whole thing. Then you fast forward a decade, and the scene in my journal, it just repeats itself. But the actors have completely flipped.
Okay.
This time, I was being scolded by a group of activists on the left. I'd questioned a specific dogma of cancel culture, and boom, suddenly, I was the enemy again.
The same energy.
Identical. The terminology was different. Instead of unpatriotic, I was problematic. But the feeling, that feverish insistence that I swallow a grandiose authoritarian agenda whole or else be cast out, it was the same.
It's incredibly isolating.
It felt that way at the time, like I was constantly the negative person in the room, always the one saying no. But then I had this realization that completely shifted how I view those moments.
What was that?
I realized that my refusal to join the neocons, then the woke left, and now, the populist right, it wasn't actually about being negative or cynical. It was a survival mechanism.
Ah, so a defense?
Exactly. That instinct to say no wasn't a failure of conviction. It was actually society's immune system kicking in. And it begs the question, what if the most positive, constructive thing you can do in modern politics is simply to reject the package deal everyone is trying to sell you?
That's a powerful framing.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive. We're going to take that instinct, that individual survival mechanism against these large, authoritarian, sweeping agendas, and frame it within a proper sociological context.
Right. Moving it from a personal feeling to a societal function.
We're not just talking about being jaded here. We're talking about analyzing the capacity for critical rejection and linking it directly to measures of societal health, the concept of anomie, and institutional resilience.
We want to understand how consistently saying no to ideological overreach might actually be what keeps common sense and, frankly, objectivity alive in Western democracies.
Okay, so let's unpack this core idea first. Rejection is so often presented in political discourse as a failure, right? You're politically homeless, you're a contrarian, a crank.
It's seen as a negative. You're not a team player.
Exactly. But what we're looking at here challenges that completely. It suggests that rejection is actually formative. It's essential for establishing any kind of truly non-aligned political stance.
It's an act of defining your own principles instead of just accepting a pre-approved set from a tribe.
And framing this as a societal immune system is key, I think.
It is, because it reframes the act as purely defensive. Think about how a biological immune system works. Its job is to defend the foundational health of the organism against, rogue invaders.
Pathogens, viruses.
Anything that tries to seize control and enforce a uniformity that's just not compatible with health. In the political body, these rogue actors are the totalizing ideologies, they're the pathogens.
Yeah, and if you look at the last couple of decades, you can really pinpoint the major political phenomena that trigger this immune response.
You really can.
I mean, you have the neocon hawks pushing the Iraq war narrative in the early 2000s. Then you get the rise of the, quote, woke left and cancel culture in the 2010s, and now the current iteration of the populist right and its anti-intellectualism.
Three very different groups, ideologically.
We're worlds apart. You've got hawkish interventionists, progressive identitarians, and nationalist populists. But the incredible thing is that they share this remarkable commonality in their operational playbook.
They do. There are three foundational traits, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Recognizing them is the key to that principled non-alignment you mentioned.
So what's the first one? How do they get a foothold?
The first is how they gain traction. All three seize on real, legitimate frustrations. They're not just making things up.
Right. The fear of terrorism post 9/11 was real. The need for social justice is real. Economic anxiety from globalization is very, very real.
Absolutely. These are real pain points. But they immediately weaponize that frustration to justify a grandiose unjustifiably broad and deeply authoritarian agenda.
They're not offering a scalpel, they're demanding a wrecking ball.
A complete demolition and reconstruction of society based on their specific predefined model. And that demand for a total overhaul means they have to immediately reject any smaller, non-ideological solutions.
They dismiss them as weak or inadequate. That's critical, isn't it?
It is. For the neocons, the idea of just using better policing and targeted intelligence to prevent terror, that was seen as insufficient. They needed a clash of civilizations.
A total war. And for the extreme left, things like measured social reforms or evidence-based poverty reduction, they're often rejected for these more rigid, sweeping identity frameworks.
And for the populist right, any kind of reasoned debate on economic policy is thrown out in favor of, build a wall. Dramatic, simple nationalist gestures.
The common thread seems to be an appeal to raw emotion over objective facts.
That's the core of it. They use fear or moral outrage or economic grievance to bypass the need for surgical, demonstrable fixes.
Right.
And this reliance on emotion leads directly to their second common trait.
Which is?
The immediate need to shut down free speech.
Of course, because the whole agenda can't survive rational scrutiny.
It can't. The structure's too weak. If you let people openly debate whether the Iraq War would actually increase safety, the whole argument just falls apart.
And if you allow an open discussion on whether certain aspects of cancel culture are actually, counterproductive to achieving social justice, the people demanding that ideological purity lose their power instantly.
Free speech is the natural enemy of the grandiose, totalizing agenda, period.
Okay, so that's two. What's the third common trait?
The third, and maybe the most insidious, is that these agendas are rarely organic responses to what's happening on the ground. They are rooted in deep, predetermined ideological and philosophical positions.
So they're opportunistic.
Fundamentally opportunistic. The ideologues are just waiting for the next crisis, a terror attack, a racial flashpoint, a market crash, so they can swoop in and present their prepackaged, totalizing worldview as the only solution.
And that's why they demand total allegiance and fear free speech. Because if you expose the underlying long-held ideology, most people would become instantly skeptical of the sudden revolution they're demanding.
Precisely. It's a bait and switch.
It's exhausting just laying it all out.
Yeah.
So the real power of this principled non-alignment, this immune response, it comes from consistently rejecting these three traits, no matter what political logo is on the box.
Yes. Standing firm against these authoritarian narratives is the necessary action for preserving those foundational Western values we talk about. Freedom of conscience, scientific integrity, the pursuit of objectivity, free speech itself.
It's the ultimate defense mechanism.
It is. And it's so important to stress that this focused rejection is not nihilism. You're not rejecting everything.
No.
You're specifically targeting only the overly broad, authoritarian, grandiose, ideological narratives. That's the pathogen.
And when you clear the political space of those systems, it actually leaves room for practical, non-ideological, reformist ideas to finally take root.
That's the constructive part. That's the payoff. If you aren't constantly fighting to realize some utopian vision of societal transformation, you can actually focus on pragmatic improvements.
You can look at supporting ideas like universal basic income or implementing ranked choice voting to break the two-party chokehold or advocating for judicial reform to limit political power.
These are policy proposals that come from observing real-world problems and data.
Yeah.
They don't require you to swear allegiance to a specific political tribe. They're just reforms aimed at making society more functional and more fair.
But you have to be consistent in your rejection.
Oh.
Right. We saw the danger of failing to do that in the last decade.
We did. Many people rightly rejected the authoritarianism coming from certain corners of the progressive left. The demand for ideological purity, the rigidity.
But because that rejection was so narrowly focused on just one side.
They got pulled in. They were gradually pulled into aligning with the equally authoritarian populist right, which was selling its own brand of ideological purity and virulent anti-intellectualism.
It's the classic case of rejecting one master only to immediately fall into the thrall of another.
It's an ideological shell game. The commitment to non-alignment has to be consistent and equal. True political health requires skepticism towards all ideologically driven, grandiose authoritarian agendas. It doesn't matter if they come wrapped in the flag of neocon foreign policy, progressive identity politics, or populist nationalism.
That consistent rejection is the path to institutional health and, maybe more importantly, political independence for the individual.
So we've talked about the political price of this rejection being cast out, feeling like an exile.
Right.
But what's the social price of the environment that makes that rejection necessary? That feeling of political homelessness, that social isolation. It's not new. The sociologist Emil Durkheim described it over a century ago as something far more dangerous than just isolation. He called it anomie.
Anomie. A word we hear a lot, but it's often, reduced in casual conversation to just normlessness. But Durkheim's definition was much more powerful than that.
So much more powerful. It wasn't just confusion. It was something painful and deeply damaging.
He viewed anomie not just as a lack of norms, but as derangement.
Yes. For him, it was a painful condition for the individual and for the entire society. And crucially, he saw it as an act of injustice. He even called it a sacrilege against the dignity of a human person.
Wow. So this isn't just a political inconvenience. It's a deep moral and social failure, a state of dysfunction.
Exactly. And Durkheim rooted this derangement in the very structure of human nature through his concept of homo duplex.
Homo duplex. So we are two people in one body, the chaotic egoistic self and the disciplined social self.
Precisely. Twofold man. We have the lower pole, which is our egoistic will, driven by inherently unlimited desires. And then we have the higher pole, which is the external restraining moral authority, which for him was primarily the state, that imposes necessary limits and establishes justice.
And political anomie happens when that gets flipped upside down.
It's a complete reversal of homo duplex. The lower pole, the unbridled egoistic will of the people, or more accurately, of powerful special interests, predominates and takes over the rules of society. Meanwhile, the state completely fails to perform its moral regulation function.
And if the chaotic self-interested ego is running the government, that must feel exhausting and fundamentally illegitimate to the average person living through it.
It creates chaos. The outcome of that reversal, where the unrestrained will of special interests dictates policy over any sense of moral authority, is what Durkheim called a pseudo-democracy.
A pseudo-democracy.
He saw it as a system just characterized by intense chaos, constant stormy political changes, pervasive instability. He even used the strong word evil because that egoistic will is inherently unstable and unconstrained. It lacks the moral discipline needed for cooperative social life.
And this political decay, driven by the ego, it doesn't just stay in the capital, does it? It inevitably seeps into economic life and corrupts it as well.
That's the next step. It leads directly to economic anomie. When the politically anomic state completely fails to regulate the economic sector, you see a total shift in what society values.
Everything becomes secondary to money.
All major social functions, education, justice, welfare, they become secondary to raw economic functions. Production becomes the single, isolated aim with no moral or social regulation. The system effectively tells its citizens that the only worthy goal is unlimited economic attainment.
Which is, by definition, an impossible goal. You can never reach it.
Precisely. And Durkheim offered this profound psychological warning. To pursue a goal, which is by definition unattainable, unlimited economic acquirement, infinite growth, is to condemn oneself to a state of perpetual unhappiness.
He even said that just redistributing property wouldn't fix it.
Right, because the root problem is the unregulated nature of unlimited desire. The system is structurally designed to make you feel perpetually insufficient.
That constant feeling of insufficiency, plus the instability of a pseudo-democracy, that brings us straight into the modern U.S. political climate. We can see these crystal clear manifestations of political anomie, especially in the systemic corruption of democracy.
It's hard to look at modern lobbying and not see the government as the tool and servant of the economic sphere, as Durkheim put it, rather than a moral arbiter.
The whole system has been transformed. The First Amendment right to petition the government, which historically meant, citizens communicating real local concerns,
has been replaced by a system where financial capital corporations, huge trade associations, elite funders, largely dictates political change through massive financial leverage. It turns a right into a transaction.
And all the attempts to control it, like transparency acts, they seem to be constantly playing catch-up or they just get ignored. This is so visible in the revolving door phenomenon.
The revolving door is maybe the clearest physical manifestation of political anomie. It's the widespread practice where former government officials immediately pivot to these incredibly lucrative lobbying careers and sometimes back again.
And the numbers are staggering.
In the 2000s, studies showed that nearly 2/3 of all federal lobbying by dollar value involves someone who had previously been a congressional staffer or a member of Congress. The whole thing is cynical and transactional. Interest groups hire lobbyists based on which party holds power. You saw huge spikes in hiring Democratic lobbyists after the 2006 and 2008 elections.
And for the officials leaving Congress, it's an immediate financial windfall. Their salary can increase tenfold compared to what they made in public service.
And even when there are supposed to be rules, like a 2-year cooling off period, they're just circumvented. They'll take the title of senior advisor or consultant until they can legally lobby. But there's almost no public disclosure of what they're actually doing during that time. They're still selling your insider knowledge, just under a different title.
And for the average citizen watching this, it just creates this deep sense of betrayal. You see an official who campaigned on public service immediately cash out for 10 times the salary, and it just confirms that feeling that the law itself is rigged.
That the whole system is designed to serve money, not morality or the public interest. That feeling of betrayal is the very essence of political anomie.
We see the same thing in campaign finance. I mean, the data on lawmakers who receive over 50% of their contributions from out-of-state donors is shocking.
Or those who receive twice as much from their top few donors as their next highest. It's a clear signal that the legislators' primary loyalty isn't to their local constituents, but to national or industrial economic interests.
And then you have the complete corruption of the disclosure system through dark money.
After those Supreme Court decisions in 2007 and 2010, the money trail just vanished. You have these politically active nonprofits, 501c4s like Crossroads GPS or Americans for Prosperity. They can collect vast contributions, millions of dollars, without ever disclosing the donors' names.
And they can spend up to 49% of their funds on political activity. The whole premise that disclosure informs the electorate, which the Supreme Court itself affirmed, is completely undone by this opacity.
You get these situations where a corporation might publicly support a specific piece of legislation, like healthcare reform, while simultaneously funneling millions through dark money groups that are actively fighting that exact same reform behind the scenes.
It's a purposeful maze. They can create shell corporations just to obscure the real identities of million-dollar donors, making it impossible for the public or even regulators to follow the money.
This widespread bipartisan corruption, where the law's function is made secondary to financial gain, is the textbook definition of political anomie. It creates a societal structure that prioritizes that lower egoistic goal over the higher moral authority of the state.
Okay, so if the first major manifestation is the corruption of democracy, the second major symptom of anomie is xenophobic nationalism, what we often call populism.
And again, this is a symptom of societal derangement, not a healthy political movement.
Phenomena like the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of President Trump in the US, sociologically, they're seen as a reaction to the painful disintegration of social bonds and economic stability.
Yes. When ordinary people feel fundamentally unprotected against the destructive forces of the market, of globalization, of impersonal governance, they seek a deep compensatory belonging. They're searching for a meaningful community.
And that profound need for belonging is then exploited by xenophobic rhetoric, which provides a convenient external enemy and, it pacifies the fear that comes from economic loss. You're told your problem isn't the system, it's the other.
And this reaction is highly organized. The data confirms it across Europe. About 1/5 of European voters, that's over 55 million people, are now choosing authoritarian populist parties. They're looking for stability and moral clarity in the chaos, and populists offer it in the form of this rigid exclusionary identity.
This brings us right back to Durkheim's idea of moral violation. Xenophobic nationalism is anomic because it allows an individual to justify aggression toward a specific group, blaming immigrants, for example, while conveniently skipping any necessary moral reconciliation.
Patriotism is directed aggressively outward, violating foundational ethical commitments to humankind, all in the name of reclaiming stability.
Which is why that individual act of rejection we started with is so powerful. I think about that story of Elias, the foreman in the Rust Belt town.
Yes.
He rejected the Iraq war fervor when everyone around him was waving flags. Then years later, when his town was crumbling, he rejected the simple burn it all down rhetoric of the populist rage.
He was maintaining a localized zone of sanity, a distinct lack of anomie. He refused to participate in the collective hysteria of either era. His principled rejection stabilized his own local life and community, while the broader social fabric was actively fraying all around him.
The story of Elias and my own experience, it really demonstrates the individual cost of this principled rejection. You often find yourself in a state of political exile.
Which brings us to Sarah, the mid-level policy analyst whose story we looked at. She was essentially blacklisted not once but twice by institutions on opposing sides of the aisle.
It's such a modern parable of what happens when you refuse the package deal. She was a moderate conservative policy thinker, but she was rejected by the conservative right for questioning dogma specifically, questioning the religious right's rigid views on gay marriage by appealing to limited government principles.
So she was intellectually consistent, but that wasn't welcome.
Not at all. Then she moves to a prestigious liberal institution, thinking she'd find a space for data-driven policy. But she's ostracized again. This time for rejecting the rigid oppressor versus oppressed identity framework that dominated the discourse there.
Politically homeless.
Yeah.
But her realization was key. She wasn't alone.
Right. She found this whole network of fellow political exiles, people who had been forced out or marginalized for practicing exactly the kind of principle-driven rejection we're talking about.
And her consistent principle-driven rejection is actually her greatest qualification for leadership in the current climate. We have to recognize that if we want genuine structural reform in our key institutions, academia, media, think tanks,
institutions critical to the health of a democracy.
Absolutely. That reform will not come from the committed partisans. It has to be driven by those who have demonstrated the moral courage to reject ideological capture from any side. The exiles are the ones building new frameworks based on abandoned classical liberal tenets and moderate conservative values that the main political tribes have just discarded.
This issue of defending foundational values brings us to the institutional level and the defense mechanism designed specifically to prevent this kind of ideological overreach. The Calvin Report.
The Calvin Report from the University of Chicago in 1967 is arguably the most important articulation of institutional neutrality in American academic history.
And it was drafted during a period of immense campus turmoil, right? The 60s.
Exactly. It was a response to pressure on universities to take official political stances on the major social issues of the day, the Vietnam War, civil rights. It was a proactive move to safeguard the university's core function.
And its core assertion is beautifully simple.
It is. The university must serve as a forum for free inquiry, rather than acting as a collective political entity. If the university takes a political stance, it immediately compromises its capacity to host an open debate on that topic.
It lays out two key principles to make that happen.
Two principles. The first is institutional neutrality. The university, as a corporate body, should not take official positions on social and political issues unless they directly relate to its core functions of education and research.
So the university itself can't declare that it's officially for, say, a carbon tax unless that's strictly related to a research project. The institution itself stays apolitical.
Exactly. This neutrality is designed to prevent the university from being weaponized or politicized. The second, equally important principle, is academic freedom. This protects individual faculty and students, ensuring they have the full freedom to express their views, even controversial ones, without fear of institutional censorship or reprisal.
The report warned that universities shouldn't become instruments of social change if that compromises their commitment to objective inquiry. And this concept is incredibly relevant today, isn't it?
It's at the heart of the debates over DEI policies and so-called cancel culture within academia.
And the debate over the Calvin Report highlights this persistent fundamental tension. The critics argue that institutional neutrality can be a moral shield, right? A way to justify inaction in the face of pressing moral concerns like climate change or racial injustice.
They'll say that staying neutral is effectively taking a side.
But the proponents of Calvin would argue the exact opposite, that this neutrality is the only way to preserve the long-term integrity of academic institutions.
Because if the university takes a side, it risks alienating dissenting voices and eventually being captured by the prevailing political ideology of the moment. And once that capture occurs, the university stops being a place that seeks truth and starts being a place that enforces dogma.
Its primary function is to host debate and facilitate objective inquiry, not to be a political actor.
So the Calvin approach is, in itself, a systematic, institutionalized rejection of ideological package deals.
And this defense of objectivity, it often looks, well, tedious. It doesn't look heroic. Which brings us back to the individual level, to the story of Dr. Harrow, the professor of biology.
Yes. At a prominent UK university, he found himself fighting a literal two-front war against ideological capture, which perfectly illustrates what happens when this rejection is necessary on multiple fronts.
What were the two fronts?
On one side, he faced significant administrative pressure to adopt certain postmodern critical theories. theories that often label the insistence on objective scientific truth, data, and meritocracy as simply cultural imperialism.
So that's a grand narrative attack on objectivity coming from within the elite structure itself.
Exactly. On the other side, he was getting continuous hate mail and harassment from the populist right, attacking his climate research as an elitist hoax and dismissing his expertise outright. That's a grand narrative attack on scientific integrity coming from anti-intellectual populists.
So what was his grand revolutionary defense when confronted with pressure from both the administrative left and the populist right?
It was what was described as a dull, unexciting defense.
Not very dramatic.
Not at all. He simply refused to sign the loyalty pledges, refused to adopt the required ideological language, and absolutely refused to soften his data or alter his research methodology. He just stood up and quietly said that he rejected any agenda from the left, the right, or the administration that superseded the evidence.
So what does this all mean for defending these foundational Western values? It means the immune response isn't always a dramatic revolution.
It means the genuine defense of scientific objectivity, of meritocracy, of free inquiry, is often a persistent, stubborn act of principled rejection. It's the refusal to budge from the foundational principles of truth and evidence in the face of ideological capture, no matter where it comes from.
Dr. Harrow's quiet rejection ensured that data and evidence, not a grandiose, predetermined narrative, remained the ultimate authority in his lab. And in doing so, he defended the integrity of his entire field for the next generation.
Okay, so we've established that the individual capacity to reject these authoritarian agendas is both a political defense and a necessary response to this sociological paralysis to anomie. Let's pivot now to the empirical evidence. How does this environment of instability actually affect an individual's capacity to adapt and thrive?
Yes, and we define that capacity here using the social ecological resilience model. This model is important because it emphasizes that resilience isn't just an internal trait. It depends on both internal factors and external resources that you access through your social networks.
So the research we looked at dug into the relationship between anomie, social capital, and resilience, specifically within the highly turbulent contemporary U.S. political climate, especially after the pandemic. Exactly. The key question was, what truly allows individuals to navigate their way to their resources? Psychological, social, cultural, physical, Reslantics, that sustain their well-being in a chaotic world.
And the findings, they absolutely confirmed what the sociological framework suggested. Relationships and perceived stability are far more important predictors of survival than ideological alignment or even how much money you have.
That is the dominant, resounding finding. Social capital, which is defined as social trust, strong social bonds, and the ability to network with both similar people, that's bonding, and dissimilar people, that's bridging.
That was the clearest, strongest positive predictor of social ecological resilience.
Yeah, by far.
Yeah.
It suggests that if you want resilience, you need connections. The ability and the willingness to work with a diverse network of people is crucial for accessing the resources that foster adaptation and survival. Relationships are the ultimate survival tool.
So the less isolated you are and the more you can build bridges across differences, the more likely you are to be able to bounce back from hardship.
Okay, so conversely, what did the research show about the corrosive effect of anomie?
As we anticipated, anomie, that perception that social trust is breaking down and that political leadership is ineffective or illegitimate, it clearly and negatively predicted resilience.
So it directly drains your ability to cope.
The strength of that negative relationship suggests that this painful state of social derangement directly drains both individual and societal capacity for resilience. It makes people less capable of adapting to change. That's a profound sociological insight, isn't it? Anomie isn't just chaos. It means our collective capacity to endure and respond to challenges is fundamentally eroded.
Right. It represents the risks a society takes when it neglects the social conditions and moral regulation of its people. Resilience, on the other hand, is a reward for attending to them.
And when people feel en masse that the rules are arbitrary, that the system is corrupt, that they can't trust their leaders or each other, the foundation for collective action just collapses.
Their fundamental ability to adapt and thrive in the face of a challenge is corrosively eroded. Anomie is the acid that eats away at the social fabric you need for resilience.
Now, there was an extremely powerful and I have to say slightly disturbing finding in this data regarding income and the perception of anomie. We often assume that this feeling of societal breakdown is concentrated among the economically marginalized.
That assumption was completely challenged by this data. Socioeconomic status or income was not found to be correlated to the perception of anomie in this sample.
Think about that for a second. High-income individuals were just as likely to perceive failed leadership and rapidly eroding social trust as low-income individuals.
This is an incredibly significant finding. It strongly indicates that the crisis of institutional legitimacy and pervasive political anomie. It's not just a problem of economic disparity. It is a widespread, systemic crisis affecting the entire social structure, regardless of where you sit on the income ladder. It's a crisis of faith in the system itself.
That is a key takeaway. The wealthy feel the system is failing just as much as the poor do, maybe for different reasons. The rich see instability as a threat to their future, the poor see it as a current oppression, but that collective perception of institutional crisis is universal.
It is. But let's look at financial resources on their own. While income didn't correlate with perceived anomie, it did still correlate with individual resilience.
Right. It was a positive predictor, though not as strong as social capital.
Which confirms the practical reality that financial resources matter. Of course they do. Those with steady and sufficient incomes are simply less vulnerable to immediate shocks like food or housing insecurity, which in turn impacts your mental and physical health.
Money dictates access to tangible resources that foster resilience.
It does. It means broad social and economic change is still necessary to increase resilience across the board.
The finding about the impact of COVID-19 was also counterintuitive, wasn't it? Especially compared to the early research during the pandemic.
It was. The initial data in the first year showed sharp drops in resilience. But in this later study, conducted about 2.5 years into the crisis, the perceived impact of COVID-19 actually positively predicted resilience, albeit with a very small effect.
So the initial shock passed and people adapted. Is that the theory?
That's the leading hypothesis. Participants had enough time to adjust their resources, both internal and external, and return to some kind of adaptive functioning. We're highly adaptive creatures.
But the positive correlation also suggests something else.
It strongly suggests the possibility of post-traumatic growth. It may be that those who are more severely impacted by the distress and exposure of the pandemic, the loss, the fear, the disruption, experienced a powerful form of growth that compelled them to boost their internal coping mechanisms and seek out external resources.
So they ended up with higher resilience scores, despite the hardship they went through.
Or because of it. Resilience isn't just bouncing back. Sometimes it's bouncing forward stronger.
And finally, the research presented a really complex, mixed set of racial findings, particularly for the Black participants in the sample. It seems to embody this very idea of maintaining sanity despite sociological derangement.
This is a powerful finding that illustrates the complexity of resilience under structural duress. Black participants reported statistically higher social ecological resilience scores compared to other groups in the sample.
So higher resilience.
Yet simultaneously, Black race was negatively correlated with social capital, suggesting lower access to or connectivity within traditional social networks, but positively correlated with anomie, indicating a heightened perception of systemic failure, institutional breakdown, and illegitimate leadership.
That is a profound contradiction. It really challenges the idea that resilience requires systemic trust. You have high personal resilience coexisting with clear, perceived systemic failures and lower levels of social connectivity, at least as measured by the survey.
It implies a deeply complex and robust adaptive capacity where high personal resilience is maintained even in the face of structural adversity and societal derangement. It confirms that racial disparities in social capital and perceptions of leadership failure are real, profound problems, even as the individual and collective capacity to endure, resist, and adapt remains incredibly high within that community.
It's a resilience born from necessity and historical experience rather than from institutional support. So this entire deep dive into the politics of rejection, it seems to reveal a fundamental truth. That instinct to say no to a political package deal, the feeling of exile, the refusal to accept authoritarian grand narratives, it is not a political flaw.
No, it's a necessary, principled stand against the structural and ideological overreach that generates chaos and sociological paralysis anomie in society.
True societal health depends less on how many people we can gather under one ideological banner.
And far more on the capacity of individuals and institutions to consistently reject those overly broad authoritarian narratives offered by political tribes. This principled skepticism preserves the necessary space for truth, for objective reasoning, and for genuine social cooperation, that crucial social capital to thrive.
Whether it's Dr. Harrow refusing to let ideology supersede data in the name of science, Or Elias the Foreman rejecting the collective hysteria of both war hawks and populists in his community. This principled, non-aligned rejection acts as society's constant, vital immune system.
And it must occur quietly and persistently within our institutions and loudly in our political discourse to prevent the systemic decay and derangement of the social contract that we're seeing everywhere today. This capacity to say no to the totalizing narrative is the most potent defense of foundational Western values that we have, and it must be fiercely protected.